We're very pleased to have a fantastic panel to lead this off. Ambassador Arturo Sarucan will start with some introductory remarks. Undersecretary Gerardo Rodriguez will give a keynote address. We'll hear from Mark Sobel, the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Treasury Department. Then we have an absolutely fantastic panel with Ambassador Andres Rosenthal, Colin Bradford, and John Sewell, who I will introduce. Well, let me turn it over to John Sewell. Will actually be moderating all of this and taking advantage of his vast knowledge and long history working on G20 issues, as well as many other global financial issues. To start off, however, we have the pleasure of having Ambassador Arturo Sarucan with us, who has been following this very closely. In addition to representing Mexico ably in the United States, is someone who has a vast knowledge on these issues. And Ambassador Sarucan, would love to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon. I don't know if I actually have a very vast knowledge of the G20 issues. Certainly a great deal of interest, and certainly working in tandem with our Sherpa and the Ministry of Finance, as you all know, is the lead agency in Mexico that is dealing with the G20 summit. But certainly this is a very important issue, both for Mexico and I think for the construction of something that I will talk about in a few minutes, of a new rules-based international system. So again, Andrew, thank you for hosting us. Thank you for hosting the Mexican chair, and a discussion on Mexico's agenda for the G20 summit. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that there's certain relevance to the fact that Mexico is the second emerging economy to assume the presidency of the G20 and to host a leader summit. The summit will be June 18-19, first country to do so in Latin America, and I think therefore there's a great deal of opportunities behind Mexico's presidency. I think in many ways it is a recognition of a long-standing reality that emerging markets do play, can play, need to play a major role in the world economy, a trend which is only going to increase in the near future. And I would say, most of you are going to say, well, what else would the Mexican ambassador say? But I think that Mexico has, not only in the run-up to the summit per se, but since Mexico became a member of the G20 during its founding, I think Mexico has responsibly stepped up to the plate in working with our G20 partners in fashioning this 21st century post-Cold War international architecture, which I think is called to play such an incredible and important role. Behind this also, I think, is a growing world vision in Mexico of the role that Mexico needs to play as a pivot nation. Not only are we an emerging, developing, emerging economy, but because of our geographic position, the very vigorous, ambitious free trade network that we have developed since NAFTA and the ability and the connections that this provides Mexico, I think Mexico can play a pivoting role, which is not easy. I think you saw a bit of that in COP16. I think that the fact that we sort of straddle emerging markets, developed countries, we understand the needs of countries at different stages of development, and therefore can help build bridges between dynamic emerging economies, developed countries, on a host of issues, whether it's climate change, and you know that this was no easy feat, the one that was pulled off in Cancun in COP16. Mexico was in some ways sort of caught between, in Homeric terms, between Scylla and Charybdis. That is, countries that feel that emerging economies need to be much more responsible for climate change. For climate change and environmental mitigation. On the other hand, emerging economies that feel that it's not their responsibility. The historical polluters are the industrialized economies, and therefore why should we pay the price of, impinging upon, raising obstacles to our ability to grow and expand our economies. And so it is in that space where Mexico, I think, found a very important niche in which we were able to sort of bridge those two perceptions. I think we clearly said that a country like Mexico, regardless of the fact that we are an emerging economy, despite the fact that we historically are not as responsible as the industrialized world for carbon emissions, for example, we do have a responsibility to play. We do have a role to play. We do need to bring down carbon emissions. And it is these positions, I think, which Mexico has been developing as part of its diplomatic toolbox, which I think augur well for what Mexico has been doing in the run-up to the G20 summit. Inclusiveness is what has been underpinning Mexico's approach to the G20. The Undersecretary has spent countless hours, mileage, ensuring that we're not only talking to the countries that form the G20, but other key players that have been invited to participate in the summit. But more importantly, that we need to engage and ensure the co-stakeholdership of civil society, of academia, of think tanks, of the business sector. And I think there is, in many ways, a unique opportunity which could crystallize in Cabo San Lucas during the G20 presidency because of the great amount of work that the Mexican Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Finance, have been putting into ensuring that everything from think tanks, and this is a fabulous initiative that Andrés Rosenthal has spearheaded in coupling think tanks and research and thinking in think tanks to the G20 process. Civil society, in this day and age, I think no one would dare to go to Cabo San Lucas, negotiate, discuss in the dark, and then come out, parade whatever results are there, and then assume that civil society will immediately become a co-stakeholder to that agenda. If we don't bring in civil society, if we don't bring in the business sector from day one, that conveyor belt between the decision-making process in G20 and how public opinion, the business sector, the markets will react to what comes out of G20 could suffer. So I think there's been a very important emphasis by the Mexican presidency in ensuring that all these groups become fundamental co-stakeholders in the process. I think a lot of the challenges that we're seeing, whether it's in the United States with, and I'll be an equal opportunity cheerleader here, with both Occupy Wall Street on one end and the Tea Party on the other, or what you're seeing in Europe, Greece, Spain, France, Italy, what you're seeing in some countries in Latin America, is precisely a sense that public policy, there's no conveyor belt between public policy and policymaking and civil society. And what I think Mexico is trying to achieve in a very modest but I think important way is to ensure that the G20 process does have a very strong sense of co-stakeholdership in society with the business sector. We are focusing obviously on agreeing on specific measures in G20 to reach concrete agreements and commitments to overcome current challenges the international community is facing, mainly the lack of economic growth, no surprise, the need for policy coordination derived from the World Economic Outlook for 2012. I think Mexico's agenda reflects our commitment to follow up, on previous G20 priorities. We don't want to believe or think that we can reinvent the wheel come June in Cabo San Lucas, that nothing has happened before us. I think there is a process that we want to make sure that we can plug into the decision-making and deliberative process in Cabo San Lucas. But at the same time, I think the Mexican presidency includes issues that are pressing in the current world scenario and issues that highlight the importance of the G20 development agenda for developing nations. And on a personal note, let me just underscore that we've also understood that as the G20 moves forward and as we try and ensure that this can develop into a new architectural frame for the discussion of world issues, that at some point we will have to connect the discussions in the G20 with some very relevant geopolitical, diplomatic, multilateral issues that are out there, and that at some point we'll have to find a way of plugging into the G20 agenda. I'm not suggesting in any way that the G20 become a diplomatic, deliberative model that supplants the UN. It's not a mini effective UN. I'm not saying that. I simply suggest that there are relevant issues out there which not necessarily have been reflected in the G20 agenda so far, that at some point will have to come in and touch base with what is being discussed in the G20. There are two issues which for the Mexican presidency which I think mark the Mexican imprint, are the Mexican imprint in the G20, and which are very important issues for the Mexican government and for Mexican President Calderon. Sustainable development is one of them. Through green growth, it's a particular important issue. It's a cross-cutting issue that touches upon several agenda items. I know that the Undersecretary is going to give you, I'm sure, a very down-to-earth, nitty-gritty description of how we're pursuing the different boxes of the agenda. But I do want to highlight first the importance that Mexico has given to sustainable development. I think that we believe that green growth is both possible and economically sound. But we do need to find proper incentives, regulations, and financing necessary for achieving this type of growth, and those are, as of today, still absent. It is our priority to reach agreements on concrete ways to set in motion and implement strategies to finance these mechanisms. I think our nations need to agree on specific mechanisms to implement the Green Climate Fund, including the short-term financing of adaptation measures previously agreed upon, such as the Program for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, REDD+. And the payment for environmental services will be one of the best global instruments for emissions reduction. And this is an issue that I think the Mexican presidency does seek to push forward. The other sort of very Mexican component of the G20 summit is how sustainable development goes hand in hand with food security. And this is an issue which has a particular importance for a country like mine, simply because of the role that corn, maize play in the basic diet of Mexicans. But I think that we look at global food security issues and food pricing across the globe as a very important issue that impacts both sustainable development, but also some of the more pressing issues of security, stability. And again, this takes me back to what I shared with you on a personal level, which is that at some point there's going to have to be at some point down the road connectivity between the G20 agenda per se that has been developed since the Washington meeting in 2007? 2008, thank you. And the road ahead for the G20 process. In the last few years, the price volatility of foodstuffs in the context of mounting pressures on supplies by growing populations, environmental degradation and climate change has put food security, especially in low-income countries, at the top of the development agenda. Mexico will therefore seek to promote consensus on initiatives to help increase world agricultural productivity, keeping in mind market realities just as much as the sustainability of natural resources and the viability of small-scale production and producers. Let me end by underscoring that Mexico is a powerful and compelling example of how emerging economies are and should be responsible and constructive actors both regionally and globally. I do believe that one of the things that distinguishes Mexico from other emerging economies is that we do believe in a post-Westphalian rules-based international system, that we do believe in open and free and fair trade, that we do believe in the importance of deregulating, of bringing down tariffs, that this is a fundamental driver for economic growth and job creation in several regions around the world, that Mexico is seeking to provide global solutions for global challenges, and that at the end of the day, for those of us in the box of the emerging economies, G20 is an opportunity to send out an unequivocal but very powerful message. And for those of you who know me well, you know that I am usually very undiplomatic. I'm a diplomat who believes that diplomacy is the art of telling people to go to hell and actually making them enjoy the trip. So what I will say is what I really think is the challenge for some of our emerging economies, which is the G20 provides a unique opportunity for the first time for emerging economies to put up or shut up. It is time for some of our countries to work together, to work as real bridges with the industrialized nations in G20, and to provide new paradigms that can provide real solutions from everyone from the most important tycoon in Mexico City to the most humble shoeshiner in the Zócalo of Mexico City. Thank you very much.
Are these on? They're on. The sound is on. I'm in charge. Thank you. As long as I don't have to raise money for the meeting, you're okay. I've been asked to moderate this discussion on the critical issues that are going to be faced by the G20 when they meet next month in Mexico. And we have a rich and very experienced panel. I could read you their long biographies, but in that case, we'd end up very close to the closing of the meeting. So I'm not going to read them except to identify them. First, we're going to hear from Mexico's Undersecretary of Treasury, Gerardo Rodriguez Regodosa, and he is Deputy Minister of Finance. He was appointed and ratified by Congress in January of 2011, and his primary role is the organization, coordination, and implementation of strategy for public debt, the design and execution of development banking policy, ensuring the stability of public finances, the supervision of financial system, and participation in international forums and organizations. We could use him here in the United States, I think, with a mandate like that. So I'm going to turn the table over to you. You can talk from there or feel free to talk from the podium, whichever you wish.
Thank you very much, John. I would like also to thank the center, Andrew, and congratulations for your recent appointment as Vice President of Program. It's very good to have an expert on Mexico to climb up the ranks. I hope that is a signal of something for Mexico going forward. Certainly participating in the G20 has helped us to better understand and reflect on the importance of multilateralism as a way to actually make the world better, agree on specific items and deal with the current challenges that we have. Chairing the G20 has certainly provided us with a much broader perspective of the usefulness of international cooperation and international coordination to deal with the current circumstances. I would like to address three different topics today. One, in the current state of the G20 process, its advantages and its disadvantages. I would like also to give you an update on how is it that Mexico is doing with regards to its G20 process in anticipation to the summit in Los Cabos in June. And third, I would like also to address some issues regarding the future challenges of the G20, some ideas that I think that can improve the process and can improve the forum going forward. The G20 has been very effective in some aspects. Now, as you know, it started as a forum just for finance ministers, and in 2008 it was raised to the level of leaders, and it has created, I think, what is a pretty solid track record. No? Coordination of macroeconomic policy, stimulus packages, on monetary and fiscal policy in the worst moments of the crisis, broad financial sector and regulatory reform. That's perhaps one of the areas in which the G20 and the FSB has the strongest track record, and also strengthening multilateral financial institutions. The G20 has also been subject to several criticisms for its either problems of legitimacy, transparency, and also the difficulties on agreeing on things. And certainly it is not a perfect forum, but the G20 is the best that we have to agree and pursue economic and financial policy. It is the best out there. We should take care of that, and taking care of that is committing, and it is actually delivering on that. We think that in order for the group effectiveness to maintain this legitimacy, we need to reinforce three different aspects. One is transparency, Second is accountability, and third is productivity. The G20 has several advantages by being an informal forum. It allows, say, countries in a more flexible way to agree and sit on the table and discuss several different agenda items. Its constitution, also being represented by several emerging economies, also allows for the G20 to incorporate in its agenda some issues that are of more global nature in terms of the challenges and needs. It also allows the G20 to connect better to the issues, the policy issues more relevant to poor countries. On the other hand, there are some features with regards to the process that represent some obstacles for agreeing and moving things faster. This raises the issue of productivity of the G20, which, as I mentioned, has been relatively good in the worst of the crisis. It can certainly be improved going forward. Countries are subject to challenges and constraints based on domestic politics, and that does not allow, say, for full commitments in several different topics that are being discussed at the G20. However, we have to think in ways to increase this productivity and moving forward the agenda and providing results in these other not necessarily very core economics and finance agenda, as the fight against climate change, promoting the creation of jobs and increasing opportunities for the poorest. Another problem of the G20 has to do with its lack of transparency. Leaders' declarations and minister communiques serves to inform the world of the decisions being made during the meetings. However, the documents, the concept notes, and the reports are kept away from the public eye for the most part. Some of the decisions, actually, a number of them, are not fully transparent even for some of the members that are sitting on the table. This lack of transparency of the G20 is also related to modest levels of accountability, which is another, say, important topic to be improved by the G20. And accountability is very closely related to the legitimacy of the G20 itself. There is no other way to convince the rest of the world of our intentions and effectiveness than to be fully accountable for commitments. Countries need to be fully accountable of commitments. Accountability is a necessary condition for credibility and confidence. And credibility and confidence are at the very core of stability of financial markets and economic stability in general. So these three concepts, transparency, accountability, and productivity, we think are essential components for the G20 to be strengthened. These, by the way, are three basic principles that Mexico has considered from the very beginning in terms of the design of the G20 agenda for 2012 and for the strategy to conduct its presidency throughout the year. We intended to reflect all these three concepts from the very beginning, publishing a discussion paper which had the different objectives, priorities, and potential deliverables that would take place throughout the Mexican presidency. So let me talk about how is it that we're doing with regards to those items that were put in the agenda back in December. We think that the exercise so far, I mean, we're 5 months into the presidency of the G20. It has been productive, and we believe that it can be translated into significant progress as we move to the leaders' meeting in Los Cabos in June. Let me go over some of the main items of the agenda to give you an update. First, The G20 was instrumental to agree on the additional resources for the IMF last weekend here in Washington with $430 billion. And let me describe briefly how this process or how this agreement was achieved. Remember, back in December of last year, we faced an environment of high levels of risk, increased volatility, and low levels of confidence, mostly associated with the problems of sovereign debt in Europe. We established as one of our priorities, it was actually the third priority, to improve the international financial architecture in an interconnected world. That could be done, among other things, with the expansion of global financial resources for crisis prevention and also crisis resolution. In order to pursue this objective, we created a working group within the finance track, and we invited both Turkey and Australia to co-chair that group. In February of this year, at the ministerial meeting in Mexico City, we examined the options to increase the resources of the fund and how this could be mobilized in a timely manner. We discussed also that Europe should go first in strengthening their own facilities, and Europe actually committed to do that in March. So they delivered on their commitments in March, Europeans, by combining on a temporary basis the two support facilities, the ESM and the EFSF, and with that they opened sort of the door for the rest of the G20 to discuss on additional IMF resources. That was the way in which we got to the April spring meetings here at the World Bank and the IMF, in which G20 countries alongside the IMF were gathered. Actually, it was a joint launch session in which there was an agreement to enhance IMF resources for crisis prevention and resolution in the order of $430 billion. Now, resources will be available for the whole IMF membership in case actually market circumstances require for countries to go to the IMF. Second, recovery, economic growth, and employment remain at the very top of the G20 agenda. Countries have made substantial progress with regards to their commitments of the Cannes Action Plan, and we have all agreed to several priorities that will be part of the Los Cabos Action Plan to be presented to leaders in June. Third, we've made also some progress in implementing the financial regulatory agenda and working in common global standards. No? We are also, as a complement to this financial regulatory agenda, we're working on the strategy to strengthen the Financial Stability Board, to give a permanent legal status, provide also with certainty with regards to the financial and human resources that this institution will need to continue overseeing the international financial regulatory reform agenda. We also recognize the importance of financial inclusion, especially in emerging economies, and took several different actions to foster strategies for financial education and consumer protection. There will be important deliverables in Los Cabos in these three items of financial inclusion, financial education, and consumer protection. Fourth, commodity price volatility. Ambassador Sarukan already mentioned this. It continues to pose significant risks for countries, especially low income and important economies. In the worst scenarios, it can certainly jeopardize food security, and because of that, it is a relevant global challenge that needs to be addressed by the G20. We have received a number of different policy options to address these problems from international organizations, and we're working in order to come up with some recommendations on how to mitigate excessive commodity price volatility and its negative effect on economic growth. Fifth, we have successfully, I believe, introduced a transversal, a cross-cutting green growth agenda across the finance and Sherpa's track based on 8 different pillars. We have taken important steps also to formalize a discussion about climate finance among ministers of finance, which, by the way, has not been easy. There are different opinions with regards to the legitimacy of the G20 to address these issues, but however, it is an important item for Mexico, and we're pushing hard on this. Overall, the overarching agenda that we envisioned back in December to focus on growth, economic development, and job creation has found concrete deliverables and important progress. All of them will find their ways to our leaders this coming June. So to finalize, let me go to the third topic in terms of the future of the G20. I would like to reiterate some of the concepts that I already mentioned, which I think are essential for this group to maintain its relevance and effectiveness to solve short and medium term economic problems. As I mentioned before, a stronger G20 requires more transparency, accountability, and productivity. And Mexico is taking some very, very concrete steps in that direction. In terms of transparency, we think that informing in a transparent ways on our goals and the mechanisms that we will use to fulfill these commitments are very relevant, are essential for the G20's future. G20 countries' actions have a direct impact in global markets. A number of non-members are deeply interested in the decisions that are taken in our meetings. So increasing transparency will bolster confidence in the G20 group. We have put a special effort to increase transparency, first by publishing continuously topical and general papers with our vision and objectives of the presidency. We started, as I mentioned, back in December with the publication of the discussion paper, Mexico's Presidency of the G20. This document had the objectives, priorities, and deliverables, as well as a calendar of events that were to take place throughout the G20 Mexican presidency. This effort of December was complemented with the publication of concept notes and additional documents in very specific topics such as financial inclusion, green growth, and climate finance. And moreover, we have agreed at the deputies and ministers level, something that had not happened before, which is to make all documents that are produced by multilateral institutions to make them available for the public. So all the surveillance notes by the IMF, the documents produced by the OECD for the G20 are being made public right after the meetings. This is something that had not happened in a generalized way before. Accountability is fundamental for the G20. It's, we think, the only way to enhance legitimacy. And we have to think about mechanisms to hold countries accountable for their commitments without delving into excessive bureaucracy. We, during our presidency, are taking, we think, important steps to strengthen accountability. Within the framework group process, the mutual assessment process, we've incorporated a full chapter to have an external institution, in this case the IMF, develop some accountability reports with regards to the policy commitments that countries have done as part of previous action plans. So that's something that will be there for Los Cabos as well. We are working on top of that in a broad accountability assessment of the G20 process since it began. No? This is something we've been discussing with our Canadian colleagues. We think it would be a good exercise to go back to all the commitments and then be able to say how countries are doing with regards to those commitments. In terms of productivity, let me share with you just some final thought, because it leads to the institutional design of the G20. We think that to the extent that the G20 is more productive, I mean, it agrees on concrete items, deliverables that are useful. We think that it can be more useful itself. As I mentioned, during the periods of crisis, the G20 was very productive, especially in 2008 and 2009. And there was this perception that the G20, just because of its institutional design, was a very productive forum. And then people started adding agenda items for the G20, just expecting to have that same level of productivity, which of course was going to be hard, because the productivity of the G20 was given by the fact that the agenda was very narrow and the sense of urgency because of the crisis was there. So how to balance this issue of productivity and addressing global challenges? No? Global challenges are very diverse, and if you want to have agreements, you have to have something very concrete. So scope and depth, how to combine the two. It is not easy, and it goes at the very core of the institutional design of the G20. Should the G20 continue to be just a very specific economics and finance forum, or the G20 should be, as Andres Rosenthal likes to say, a global steering committee? There are certain opinions around that, but taking the G20 from an economics and finance forum to a global steering committee, a lot of things would need to be done, and a lot of, say, improved institutional design would need to take place. In the meantime, what we try and do in terms of the design of the agenda is to cover items that are not necessarily at the very core of the agenda, but are relevant global challenges, but items in which the G20 could have a competitive advantage. That's why we incorporated financial inclusion, financial education, disaster risk management, green growth, among others. Mexico is fully committed to improve the G20 process under its chairmanship. We are working on that, and hopefully we can strengthen the G20 in the process to improve global economic prospects. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a very complete picture of what's going to take place in the next G20 meeting. I want to turn now to Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Monetary and Financial Policy, Mark Sobel. Again, I will not read the whole bio. He's had a long and distinguished career in the Department of Treasury, and he advises senior Treasury officials on a whole range of issues, including, importantly for this gathering, the Treasury Department's participation in both the G7 and the G20 process. Mark, floor is yours. You can speak from here or up there. It's up to you.
I'm going to speak 15 minutes.
Good.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to share our thoughts on Mexico's G20 agenda and the upcoming summit from a Treasury perspective. So I would like to address two issues from my department's perspective. First, our perspective on the financial agenda heading into Los Cabos, and secondly, with the summit approaching, recent questions from some think tank and academic quarters about the G20's relevance. So in the financial sphere, three topics will dominate the Los Cabos agenda: the global economy, reform of the international financial institutions, and strengthening the international financial regulatory agenda. Clearly, how to strengthen global economic growth will be the top priority, as Gerardo said. So after some stalling in momentum in 2011 and then serious stresses in financial markets late last year, the outlook has improved, but the recovery remains fragile, facing continued downside risks. Many advanced economies are still struggling to recoup output loss during the crisis. And A healthy recovery requires faster growth and job creation and a careful balance between growth and sustainable fiscal policies, central bank support, and structural reform. So strong implementation of the G20 commitments is needed, and we look forward to the Los Cabos action plan. As we head towards Los Cabos, the U.S. economy is continuing to gather strength despite higher oil prices. Growth has averaged about 2.5% since the recovery began, and the economy has added private sector jobs for 25 straight months, totaling 4.1 million. We see a stronger business sector balance sheet, stronger household balance sheets, and obviously our financial system is now strongly capitalized. While the economy is gradually firming, the financial crisis put our economy in a deep hole, and it will take time to fully repair the damage. Unemployment remains high and the housing market remains weak, and growth is not as fast as we would like. The administration has laid out a blueprint that proposes action to support growth in the short term, so as not to jeopardize the economic gains of the last 3 years. Alongside measures to support growth, the President has also outlined a balanced approach to address our formidable long-term fiscal problem, including legislation signed into law last year. This approach would reduce the deficit by more than $4 trillion over the next decade, cutting the deficit in half as a share of the economy and helping to put our nations on a sustainable course. Heading into Los Cabos, Euro area fragility remains a key risk to the global recovery. And I think that recent market volatility reminds us of that. Europe's leaders have taken important actions in recent months to strengthen their crisis response, reduce financial stress, and lay the foundations for greater stability. They've bolstered the firewall to guard against further emergency financing and needs from Euro area members. They've successfully extended large amounts of liquidity and implemented an accommodative monetary policy, and they've strengthened fiscal compacts. And Euro area members are adopting tough reforms. The success of the next phase of the crisis response will hinge on Europe's willingness and ability to apply its tools and processes creatively, flexibly, and aggressively to support countries as they implement reforms and stay ahead of markets, and to provide confidence to markets and the public that the political resolve is there to surmount the problems in the euro area and preserve a lasting monetary union. This will require sustained efforts in the presence of many challenges. To name a few, quite a few. How will Europe balance fiscal austerity in some countries with the need to spur growth, avoiding counter-cyclical fiscal policy at the European level and a downward spiral of austerity? Will countries with fiscal space let automatic stabilizers work, supporting euro area growth? Will Europe create fiscal institutions to match the depth of monetary integration? Will Europe implement structural reforms essential for growth? Will efforts be intensified to strengthen supervision and regulation and support bank restructuring and bank recapitalization at the European level? How will Europe address its internal current account imbalances? Oil prices are another risk to global growth. Over the last few weeks, crude oil prices have fallen and global oil inventories are rising, but we need to remain vigilant to the risks of supply disruptions and their economic impact. Beyond the near-term challenges facing leaders at Los Cabos, the G20 cannot lose sight of the need to put in place policies for a better balanced global economy, pursuant to the Pittsburgh Summit framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. Current account surpluses and deficits are down from pre-crisis levels, but much of the decline is cyclical, and further action is needed to guard against unsustainable imbalances reemerging. As current account deficit countries, such as the United States, work to raise domestic saving, the global economy and job creation are being hindered by insufficient aggregate demand. We need to see stronger acceleration of growth in domestic demand in current account surplus economies, such as in Germany and in emerging Asia, supported by greater exchange rate flexibility in countries such as China. Turning to the IFEs, and echoing what Gerardo said, further progress has been made this year with the conclusion of the recent agreement to mobilize an additional $430 billion in bilateral resources for the IMF. While these resources will be available to all IMF members, the additional funding will provide an important complement to Europe's recently bolstered firewall if further emergency assistance is needed for Euro area members. At the recent G20 meeting, ministers also focused on strengthening IMF surveillance. The key to strong surveillance is high quality, thorough, and transparent analysis, effectively integrating bilateral and multilateral activities, and examining the full range of policies. But it is crucial to remember that the fund was created against the backdrop of the beggar thy neighbor currency policies of the 1930s, and that rigorous surveillance of exchange rate policies must remain at the core of the fund's global mandate. Important discussions will also take place for the rest of the year on how to bolster the relative economic weight of dynamic emerging markets, such as Mexico, in the IMF. We also look forward to further progress on the international financial regulatory reform agenda. This successful agenda is now transitioning from design to implementation. This year in the G20, we are emphasizing progress on several items. Implementation of new capital rules, particularly on ensuring consistent definitions of capital and measurement of risk-weighted assets across jurisdictions. Strengthening cross-border resolution regimes. Ensuring that recovery and resolution plans are in place for globally systemic institutions. Aligning rules and regulations on trading, clearing, and reporting of standardized OTC derivatives contracts. Promoting international agreement on global margins on unclear derivatives trades, and creating a legal identifier system for financial contracts. And advancing progress on better understanding and limiting the risk posed by the shadow banking system. And as Gerardo mentioned, there's work ongoing with respect to further reforming the governance of the FSB, which we welcome. So that is a U.S. Treasury perspective on what we see as the key issues. I think it overlaps fairly closely with Gerardo's work. It's a good, thorough, and comprehensive agenda. Now, while this substantial work is being undertaken, some analysts are raising questions. Is there a G0? Is the G20 still relevant? Is the G20 succeeding? In posing such questions, it is critical to stipulate the standards by which the G20 is being assessed. Some lament the absence of global governance. Some lament national interests being placed ahead of global interests. Some might prefer a more concentrated international order. For me, the reality is that we live in a world of nation states with economic weight now more widely dispersed, and a world of interdependencies and spillovers necessitating cooperation among nations. There is, of course, complexity in greater numbers. Still, when the G20 came together in Washington and London, the world faced a deep crisis, common to all, that threatened to turn into a global depression. This was not just a crisis that major advanced economies alone could tackle. Facing severe global economic hardship, G20 countries all had an interest in doing whatever it took to prevent a dangerous synchronized global fall in economic activity. With recovery, G20 countries now face differing economic conditions, and policies need to be tailored to individual circumstances. Some countries are in surplus, some countries are in deficit, some have fiscal space, others do not. Some are concerned about overheating, others face output gaps. The G20 strategy to promote global rebalancing is embodied in the Pittsburgh Summit Framework for Strong, Sustainable, and Balanced Growth. As I noted, this framework emphasizes the roles and responsibility of surplus and deficit countries. As we all know, the formulation of economic policy takes place against the background of domestic realities. Nonetheless, and I'd echo a point Gerardo made, the ongoing mutual assessment process built around the framework has heightened policymakers' attention to the policies they must promote to foster greater balance in the global economy. So I would say it is a critical exercise in international peer pressure, reminding countries of the international ramifications of their domestic actions. And unlike G7 multilateral surveillance exercises, this is being done at the leaders level. At Pittsburgh, the G20 was designated the premier forum for international economic and financial cooperation, transforming the G7-oriented architecture of past decades. Other facets of the architecture were also modernized. So, through 2 rounds of quota reform at the IMF over the last decade, strongly backed by the United States, dynamic emerging market economies are seeing their weights in the fund increase substantially. At Pittsburgh, the United States led the effort to shift at least 5 percentage points in quota share to dynamic emerging markets. At Seoul, the U.S. helped secure an agreement by which advanced European economies committed to decrease their IMF board representation by 2 chairs. There is now a clear international consensus that the weights of dynamic emerging markets in the fund should continue to rise in the future. Mexico has been one of those dynamic emerging markets countries from the start. In the very first wave in 2006, it was one of 4 countries singled out for like special quota increases to start the process rolling. The Financial Stability Forum was transformed into the Financial Stability Board, with all G20 members joining. Standard-setting bodies, such as the Basel Committee, also expanded to include the G20. With key emerging markets joining the FSB, the scope of international financial regulatory standards now encompasses the globe. The international financial regulatory has made major strides. G20 leaders and finance ministers working through the FSB have helped shape the reform agenda and timelines while respecting the independence of standard-setting bodies. In past years, the G20 agreed on the broad principles and objectives for international financial regulatory reform, such as raising the quantity and quality of capital, increasing the transparency of OTC derivatives markets, and extending the perimeter of regulation. Already, this agenda is well in train, as evidenced by agreements such as Basel III. While current FSB work is not headline-grabbing, efforts to align nitty-gritty regulatory policies are ongoing and advancing, precisely because the G20 early on agreed to put in place high-quality standards in an internationally consistent manner and avoid a race to the bottom. There can be no doubt the global financial system is now more resilient and less dangerous. So, in conclusion, the financial agenda at the heart of the G20 is substantial and meaty. While the climate for advancing this agenda now is different and more complex than in 2008 and 2009, G20 cooperation continues to progress. It would not be realistic to expect that participation in any G grouping would trump national interests, nor would it be realistic to think that the G20 would displace other channels for cooperation, such as informal G7 conversations, BRIC gatherings, US-China bilateral discussions, and the like. Still, the G20-led financial architecture continues to evolve, helping facilitate rebalancing, better aligning the voice of dynamic countries with their growing weight in the world economy, and strengthening financial regulatory reform. There is critical work to be done in Los Cabos and over the remainder of the Mexican presidency. Mexico is successfully managing and advancing the reform agenda, and this is testimony to the excellence of its officials. Thank you.
I now want to turn to about 10 or so minutes of questions from the floor before we go on to hearing from those 2 participants listed on the agenda who have been deeply involved in designing the G20 process and in making sure that it continues to be very relevant and to succeed. So we'll open the floor for a few minutes to questions. If a microphone will be passed around, and you can pose a general question, to either one of the first two speakers or in general to both of them. Please, no speeches, but questions that they can answer, because it's one of the only opportunities you're going to have to talk to two key people involved in the next G20 meeting. I have a question right here.
Yeah, I'm Jo Marie Griesgraber with New Rules for Global Finance. Thank you for your presentations. I have a concern about the quality of transparency that was described, especially the release of papers after the meetings. My sense in a democracy is that papers should be released during the process, and there should be channels not only for those of us on the outside to listen, but also to give feedback, input, ideas, and so on. And I think that's a serious challenge. I think also the governance of in fact, the legitimacy of the G20 is a serious challenge. You have way too many countries that are rule takers instead of rule makers, and therefore the strength of the Financial Stability Board is challenged. I think it's an important undertaking. I think it's highly risky. I think they've done a good job, for example, on the resolution process. I think that's extremely positive. Then I have a tiny little question. The money that was raised, a mere $430 billion, where does it go on the IMF? Is that a special agreement to borrow? Have you set up a new arrangement to borrow? It's certainly not part of the quota. Where'd you put the money?
Either or both?
It is bilateral loans to the general resources account.
So it goes into the major pot, as it were.
Yeah, it goes to the general resources account.
It's not quotas, it's not NAB, but it's bilateral.
It is
loans
bilateral loans.
through the GRA.
Okay. In the back, on the left here.
Hi, Barbara Matthews with BCM International Regulatory Analytics.
Can you stand up, do you think, so people can see you and hear you a bit better?
Sure. Thank you for your presentations and for the transparency. I have a question about the IMF governance reform. What happens if Germany and the United States do not ratify the reform?
You want to answer that, Mike, or I can do that?
Your answer might be more interesting.
These are the easier
It certainly will, I think. That's a given.
So, you know, we are kind of working through and assessing our legislative options, but you know, the United States, long history of support for the IMF, making commitments to the IMF, and delivering on them. Germany, I can't speak for. I don't know what their situation is. Gerardo will fix all that.
You want to make any response, or? Yeah, okay, I've got a question in the gentleman here with the striped tie. The lights
Thank you.
make it hard to see people, so you can stand up and wave your hand if I've missed you. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. David Nelson with GE. Thank you very much for the presentations. Very interesting, and congratulations to the Mexican delegation for what looks to be a very successful, well-organized event. I think that the accountability issue that you raised is very interesting and a challenge in these kind of forums, particularly when a lot of people look at some of the past commitments that have been made in the G20, frankly in the G8 prior to that, and question whether countries go out the next day. And I think, as Ambassador Sarukhan mentioned the other day, a number of countries immediately violate the commitments on trade and so forth that have been made. Can you talk a little bit about the negotiations on that? You probably won't want to name names within the discussion, but one can imagine that that's challenging, both in terms of identifying who will evaluate whether countries are living up to their commitments or not, and what the penalties, if any, are to not complying with that. And just talk a little bit about the process of the negotiation and what you're finding, what you're discovering in that discussion.
We've been discussing this a lot within the G20, and it is it is a very interesting challenge because of the nature of the forum, which is an informal gathering of countries with no institutional channels to hold countries accountable for not complying with their own commitment. So the way that the G20 has internalized this reality is by doing some sort of peer pressure. That was the way that the mutual assessment process was created, so that many different countries could participate in evaluating the policy commitments and the improvements in different policy areas in countries and regions. That is a concept that we are taking one step further and developing a full accountability assessment within the framework process, within this process that started as a mutual assessment process, and rather have an external institution to provide with a standard way of evaluating how countries are doing with this commitment. So we are having now the IMF working on an accountability report. That's going to be part of the documents to be made public around the summit. So it's going to be a good way to look at these policy commitments in each of the different countries around the world. But we think that we need to strengthen that generalized accountability, taking into account the restrictions of the institutional design that we have of the G20, and that's why we're thinking of a broader accountability exercise, accountability report that we have yet to define how to do that, who takes the ownership of that, and ultimately how is it that the G20 would endorse that report. That's something that hopefully we will have time in the second semester of the Mexican presidency to work on.
That's very good. I happen to know that there are civil society groups in the United States and probably elsewhere that are thinking seriously about taking on that task too, as well as a complement to what the governments are doing themselves, which I think would be useful. And I hope Colin Bradford, when he talks, will at least mention something about that. Other questions? Comments? You've all been dazzled by this, so I'm going to turn first to Andres Rosenthal, who has so many hats that I'm not sure which one to give him to start. I've known him for more years than I care to tell you, or he cares me to tell you. But he is now president of Rosenthal and Associates. He is also, excuse me. He's both the founder and I think you're still the acting president, the president of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. And he currently chairs the Board of Trustees, I see from this. But you should know him as a outstanding one of Mexico's diplomatic corps. He's been ambassador in many places. He's played a major role in the Mexican government. And he's played a major role in ensuring that the United States takes sufficient note of what Mexico's needs and interests are. You haven't been very successful. And then he's going to speak for 10 minutes or so. Then I'm going to turn to Colin Bradford, who is also an old friend, a friend of long standing. Sorry, Colin. And he has had a long and distinguished career equally in U.S. institutions, which I'll mention in a minute. He's a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings and at the Center for International Global Innovation in Waterloo, Canada. And he's worked both on the creation of the Millennium Development Goals and on the design of the G20. So, Andres, you want to move up here where you've got a microphone? Good, you've done it already, and Colin too. And then we can start off from there. And then we will take additional questions from you as will give you a perspective on these issues. Did you bring your nameplate? Good.
Yes.
Andres, why don't you start off, okay?
Okay. Well, thank you, John, and thanks to the Mexico Institute for the invitation. I'd like to talk a little bit about the other side of the G20, that is the side that has to do with outreach, which has to do with policy inputs from the non-governmental side. Having participated in two of the efforts that relate to non-governmental participation in the G20 process, the Business 20 or the B20, and a new initiative which we did together with a series of think tanks from G20 countries and some from non-G20 countries of the Think 20, or as it's called, the Think 20 process. There are others which I haven't been personally involved in. There is the Youth 20, there is the L20, which is labor union discussions around the G20 process, but I'll just say a few words about the ones that I have worked with. The Business 20 was set up in Canada at the Toronto Summit and then went through a series of iterations up until the Cabo Summit, which fundamentally incorporates the business community at a pretty high CEO level in the preparation of concrete recommendations to the G20 leaders. We, just 2 weeks ago, had the meeting at which the B20 presented to President Calderon as the host of the G20 summit this year a set of recommendations from seven working groups on issues related to the G20 agenda that are then going to be transmitted by the Mexican president to his colleagues at Los Cabos with a meeting of the B20 immediately prior to the summit at Los Cabos itself, where there will be the opportunity for the B20 to present collectively to the leaders of the G20. As you can imagine, most of the recommendations, and I won't go through them, they're available on the Mexican G20 presidency website. Most of the recommendations have to do with issues relating to financial reform, trade and investment, green growth, transparency, accountability, and corruption, and issues fairly defined within the G20 agenda that Gerardo summarized for you earlier in his presentation. I think that my own impression is that the B20 has evolved into a very serious part of the preparatory process of the G20, involving those actors that at one point or another have a direct input and a direct relevance to the G20 agenda. So this particular B20 process for this year is probably considerably more relevant to the work of the G20 than some of the B20 processes in previous summits. The other initiative, the Think 20, which was a joint initiative between Brookings, Colin Bradford, the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, our own Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, Chatham House in London, the Lowy Institute in Australia, and the Stanley Foundation, brought together in Mexico City about 25 people and institutions that have been working on global governance issues. G20 agenda items, yes, but more broadly, global governance as a whole. And this meeting, which fundamentally took place with the presence of the Mexican government team that is preparing the G20, that is Finance Ministry, Foreign Ministry, Presidency, Economy Ministry, Agricultural Ministry, during a day and a half, listened to the think tanks presenting to them some of their concerns and recommendations regarding the G20 process. And here it was even broader in the sense that we spent a fair amount of time discussing how the G20 works, what the G20 could do to make its work more relevant to public opinion, how the G20 could survive the financial and economic crisis, and whether there was a role for the G20 going forward. The recommendations of the Think 20, which are also available on the websites of the institutions that participated, were presented to the Sherpas of the G20 in Mexico City in mid-March, and will be also transmitted to the leaders during the summit in Cabo. They were basically divided into three major sections, one relating to the establishment and reform of the international financial system and global economic governance, green growth and food security, and finally the improvement of the functioning of the G20. The point I'd like to highlight really relates to something that the previous speakers mentioned. Coming as they do, both of them, from the finance ministry side stream of G20 work, they're obviously interested and fundamentally concentrated on issues relating to finance and global economic governance. There are those among us who believe that the G20 has a raison d'etre that goes beyond the financial crisis, and that it could prove to be, if it were able to do so, it could prove to be a global steering committee rather than a crisis management forum, which is what it is up until now. In order to do that, it requires partly to be institutionalized. It requires partly to have an agenda of issues beyond the financial crisis itself, issues which are either deadlocked at the global negotiating level in other international organizations, such as the UN and the climate change negotiations and Doha and other things, disarmament. And the question really relates, I think, from the perspective of a country like Mexico, if you compare it to the country, to a country like the United States. It was very clear from what the Deputy Assistant Secretary said that the U.S. Doesn't have much interest at this particular point in time in having the G20 go beyond what it is doing. But that's because I would suspect that the United States is going to be a member of the G0, the G10, the G8, the G7, the G20, and whatever else there happen to be in the coming years, while as a country like Mexico is in the G20 and would probably not be in other types of smaller groupings relating to economic size or political weight in the world. And so therefore I think for Mexico it is important for the G20 to not only to exist but to continue. And the ability of the G20 to become more relevant to public opinion is, I think, one of its greatest challenges going forward. It is true that for finance experts and for people from Treasury Department and finance ministries and economy ministries, the relevance of the G20 is clear, and I don't think that it needs any justification. But if you look at the way public opinion has been reacting to the G20, and Colin has been running a program which he will talk to you about undoubtedly, which has tracked public opinion following of the G20 meetings from the very beginning of the G20 at the leaders level, it appears to me very clear that there is still a lot of question arising relating to what does the G20 do, why does it do it, is it successful, is it not successful. We're still in the middle of an economic and financial crisis. It's been 6 years since the G20 met for the first time at the leaders level. Where are we today? What has it done? And I think that going into the Cabo summit, it will be important for the Mexican presidency to make it equally relevant to Mexican public opinion and Mexican media. It's an expensive proposition to run one of these things. It's very costly. And you know, for a developing country to take on a hosting of something like this requires it to be able to justify to public opinion. Therein, I think, lies the importance of the outreach that has been undertaken by the Mexican government to civil society, to the labor unions, to youth, to the think tanks, and to the business community. And it would, for us, be very important to highlight this particular aspect as we go into the next presidency of the G20, which is Russia. And I think there are many among us who are not entirely convinced that Russia will be equally able to do the type of outreach programs that previous summits and the Mexican summit have done. So that's what I wanted to say, and we can take something on after that.
I'm going to turn to Colin Bradford in a second, but I want to acknowledge that Kent Hughes, who's one of the co-sponsors of this meeting, he runs the American the Global Economy program, who will be with us for the rest of the session. Colin.
This goes on automatically, I guess. Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Kent. Also, good to see you. And thank you all for being here and being interested enough in this subject to spend a couple of hours this afternoon talking with us about it. I'm going to pick up where Andres left off and tell you that I share his concern and have been vocalizing this for a couple of years, is that the summit, after all, is not just the G20 summit is not just a gathering of finance ministers. And it has run the danger, in my view, over recent years of being captured by the finance ministry agenda. It isn't really enhancing the role of leadership in the world to have leaders talking to their publics about exchange rates when 85 to 90% of the public doesn't understand what an exchange rate is. And it seems to me that the Mexicans have understood this from the beginning, is that there's some advantage to not only some advantage to differentiating the issues and the profile of the G20 summit from the G20 finance ministers, but that it's absolutely vital. I mean, in a certain sense, my starting point is that this is a triple crisis of confidence in markets, trust in leaders, and faith in institutions. Obviously, the international institutions failed to prevent the crisis. Obviously, there happens to be a concordant trend in all societies, according to Pew Trust surveys, Gallup polls, and the like, that the trust in leaders in all countries is at a historic, in most countries, there are a few like Lula in Brazil and so on, but in general, there's a historic low in trust in leaders. And clearly the whole, as Gerardo has made clear and I think articulated well, there is a connection between what the G20 deliverables are and how legitimate it is seen and how transparent it is perceived to be, and the degree of confidence in markets. And it seems to me that leaders have treated this process in a way, there is a danger of getting caught in the details. And for leaders not grasping a hold of the process, which is theirs, and putting their own imprimatur on it and trying to demonstrate to the world that they are, in fact, in charge of this agenda. And it seems to me that one way to think about it is to think about the fact that summits are to deal with strategic issues. I would define strategic issues in the following way, that uniquely fall to leaders. Strategic issues are, for example, that in many of the issues that many of you in this room would be concerned about, the future is now. The future is not in the future. In fact, the future is here. And it is the role of leaders to articulate the connection between the need to act now in order to have a future that is stable and manageable, rather than to lose control of the future. That takes some intellectual power. But more than that, it takes some ability to articulate and communicate a message that makes it clear why 1 billion people still in poverty matters, why the fact that there are another 1 billion people that don't have water, there's another 1 billion people that doesn't have sanitation, there's another 1 billion people that doesn't have electricity. How do you expect people to be productive in a world in which you have 1 billion people who don't have electricity, water, sanitation, and incomes? I mean, you're missing out on the potential of economic growth. You cannot have the world cannot survive with an additional 2 billion people with the existing 1 billion that is without these sort of very vital resources. How do you deal in a world that it's quite clear from scientific evidence that we're burning up the planet? How do you deal with the fact that we're destroying the oceans? How do you deal with the fact that the fish populations in the ocean are absolutely being depleted now? So you need, one of the roles of strategic leadership is to communicate to publics that the future is now. And it isn't a question of postponing it, but dealing with it now in order so that it doesn't cost you more in the future. And I think, frankly, part of the failure of the Europeans to marshal a big enough firewall was their inability to describe to their publics why putting a firewall of considerable size up sooner rather than later would minimize the cost later. I mean, this is the classic Nick Stern argument about climate change, is that if we deal with it now, we can deal with it with 1% of GDP. If we postpone it till later, we'll deal with it with 5% of GDP 20 years from now. So it seems to me that's a vital role for leaders that they haven't really grasped, that they haven't really pulled together and articulated a vision of the future as now to compel action now together to deal with these issues. The second thing that requires strategic leadership is spillover effects that Mark Sobel mentioned. I mean, it's clear that all of the issues I just ticked off have spillover effects. I mean, not to speak of global health challenges and so on. I mean, there's financial stability is a global challenge because the spillover effects are inevitable and uncontrollable. And, you know, that's what requires coordinated leadership. The other thing is market failures. I mean, if we think that the real price of money is zero and that the carbon price is a viable, sustainable, you know, economically, that incorporates future economic and social and environmental costs, we're crazy. I mean, we bought an ideology in the 1980s that said, get prices right. And the way you got prices right, according to the dictum of the 1980s, was you let market prices determine what the value of things were. Well, it just so happens that there are market failures, and that market prices actually don't tell you the real scarcity value of vital resources like oil, air, and water. So let's stop using market prices. Let's start using our heads. Let's start having strategic leadership around the fact that it's perfectly okay to intervene in the markets and create a tax or a subsidy which corrects a market price which is clearly wrong. And leaders are unwilling and unable so far to take on this kind of thing. And finally, I think the thing that compels strategic leadership is the horizontality, what I would call the horizontality or the connectivity among the 5 or so issues that are being discussed at Los Cabos. I mean, it's quite clear that you're not going to get the kinds of energy investments you need in the world if financial markets are unstable and unpredictable. So financial stability is absolutely crucial. But you have to have growth. And you have to have an investment-led process to get out of growth. So that leads inexorably towards what kind of growth? Where do you have it? And you introducing the green growth agenda, the tensions that were alluded to by Gerardo, as you know, between finance ministries and foreign ministries, is because finance ministries don't regard green growth as an economic issue. Well, it's an economic issue, a financial issue of premier eminence, obviously, if you believe the kind of argument that I'm giving you, that the future is now, and that we have the sooner we face the issues, the better off we will be. So, this, it seems to me, is the crucial transit that the leaders, not necessarily in Los Cabos, but over time, G20 leaders individually and collectively need, or small groups need to realize that they need to fill a leadership vacuum at the same time that they're filling a policy vacuum, and that they need to spend more time trying to figure out how to communicate to their public so that the public is convinced of actions that need to be taken now to make the world livable in the future, as well as to make it livable and sustainable now. So I think there's a sense of urgency which, if you read G20 documents and you listen to G20 discourse, you can be lulled into thinking that as you follow a specific set of issues, whether it be financial regulatory reform, food security, price volatility, or whatever it may be, you can get lulled into a discourse of understanding the complexity of, they say, the development issue in the G20, into thinking that this is the best we can do under the circumstances, when in fact it's not enough. I mean, the question now that they've left the room, I feel free to ask it, is what are they going to do if 430 billion isn't enough? And, you know, I don't think it's enough myself. So there are reasons. It seems to me that, you know, I was really appreciated Mark Sobel bringing up the fact that the G0 element. I mean, the fact that armchair academics can sit around and contemplate whether or not the G20 is quite the right configuration and whether it really is relevant is really to overlook the fact that the world without it would be in graver danger than it is with it. And the issue is how to make it work and how to strengthen it and how to inculcate a style of global leadership that's new as the forum is, and that connects the public to its own future in a way that enables parliaments and governments to act in ways that they now find it impossible to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. It seems to me it's very interesting. I'm going to open this up for questions now, or dissents, or whatever you want to throw on the floor from our two speakers, is that it struck me as listening to the two presentations that the difference between the Mexican agenda, and they're in control of it, and the U.S. agenda is really striking. There was some overlap, particularly on the immediate crisis, but it is not the same agenda at all. Is that right? Is that an accurate observation? And therefore, what's going to happen at Los Cabos?
I wouldn't say at all. I think there are commonalities, obviously, and I think Mexico and the U.S. have been working closely together on many of these financial issues. And we have now ratified the IMF reforms. We've done a lot of the work in becoming part of Basel III. And we put a great deal of emphasis on looking at the Financial Stability Board and giving it teeth so that it could actually function in a more effective way. But I think we look at, or I look at, I shouldn't say we, the vision for a G20 to move many of the deadlocked agenda items on the international scene forward, I don't think is shared by the United States government. I think the United States feels, and that's been, I think, pretty much the leitmotif of the U.S.'s participation in the G20 and having convened it in the first place, is to keep it very narrow and very focused on those issues which the United States considers to be most relevant to the immediate situation, while as I think many of us look at it in a longer term, as a longer term vision. Maybe because we are much more discouraged at the way that many of the multilateral institutions have functioned recently. The inability to conclude the Doha round, the inability to conclude climate change, the inability to discuss questions of nuclear proliferation and disarmament, the issues of transnational organized crime. One of the very clear ways in which the G20 summit in Mexico could have become very relevant to Mexican public opinion would have been if it had at least put on the agenda the issue of organized transnational crime. When there was a sort of an attempt to think about doing that, the first country to put a brake on it was the United States. So again, I think there is that difference. Focus on financial governance, financial institutions, and so on, versus a broader vision of what the G20 could do in global governance as a whole.
Don't forget, though, that Hillary did go to the.
She did.
Right.
She did. And we hosted the first foreign ministers meeting of the G20. There had never been a foreign ministers meeting. The finance ministries' hold on the G20 agenda had been such that they refused to have almost anybody discuss G20 issues other than themselves. I don't know. I can't see whether Gerardo's still in the room, but I'm sure he'll hear about it. No, I've said this to him and to his boss, the finance minister.
With a vice-like grip.
But it's to some extent natural. I mean, the G20 was set up as a finance ministers, central bank governors forum, and therefore it's natural that they should want to retain ownership. So the Mexican government convened the first foreign ministers meeting where these issues that I've mentioned were discussed. And although there was not shall we say, a meeting of minds on where the G20 could go from to the future, it was a first instance of looking at it as a political forum in addition to being a financial economic forum.
Let me throw open the floor to questions. Gentleman here.
Joe Dukert. I'm an energy policy analyst, but my question is much broader than energy. I wonder if any of the three panelists would care to speculate about what might happen to the G20 process after the election in Mexico in July and the United States in November. I have felt for a long time that nothing much would happen in almost any field in the United States until after November. I've been surprised at how much activity and progress there seems to have taken place in Mexico. But things, I think, are bound to change. In what way can we prepare for that change?
That's a very good question.
You want to take the U.S.
Yeah.
side?
U.S.? You explain.
Well,
You
want
wanna
me
tell
to
us
talk
what's gonna
about
happen?
U.S. elections and you talk about the Mexican.
That's a good idea. No, I mean, I think, you heard how Mark answered the question about the IMF reform. He didn't say it, but basically he said, this is not for quotation if any of your press people, but anyway, it's clear what he meant. It was that, we're not going to pass the IMF legislation until after the election, right? So, and that's been clear to everybody in the G20. It's not that...
President Obama, has famously been cited for what he said into an open microphone about flexibility following the November election.
Right. Well, since he's going to be reelected, I have no concerns about whether or not the good things are not about to happen. So, yeah, I think it's an unfortunate, it's an unfortunate hiatus here, and I do myself have wondered sort of why Mexico took it at this particular juncture, frankly. But it may be, as I was picking up the conversation today, earlier as well as here, is that this is a way actually of transiting the current government's agenda to the next government's agenda in terms of this particular bailiwick, at least, of international economic policy. And so, you just have to deal with the fact that elections are out there. I may have missed a nuance of your question, and work with it. The fact is that the U.S. took a position on Europe which said, the Europeans' problems are basically the Europeans' responsibility. And I think the reason that the U.S. took that position was that we couldn't belly up to the bar and put resources on the table for the IMF or anything else until after the election. And so the logical position to have was that something that precluded the necessity for you to do something you couldn't do, right? So I think it's one of these things you kind of work around, but I don't think it stalls the process or ends it, or, it's just one of the realities that you deal with. But I may have missed something in your question.
Do you want to talk about Mexico?
Well, I very quickly say that I think the situation in Mexico is quite different. First of all, we can't have re-elections, so we will have a new government no matter what. And I think that there is no intention on the part of the current administration to delay or to in any way put off implementing commitments that have been taken by Mexico over these last years, not only at the G20 level, but at almost all international levels. And so, as I mentioned, we've already ratified the IMF reform. We're already compliant with Basel III, which is quite impressive. And I'm sure that a new administration, whatever political party wins the elections on the 1st of July, will continue the agenda. I think the only, if you like, concession to the fact that we're in an election period or an election year was that President Calderón decided to host the G20 summit in June rather than in October or November, which is when normally it has been hosted in most of the previous summits, because he wanted to be still before the election took place. But I have no doubt that whatever incoming government takes office on the 1st of December will continue to see the G20 in the way that I've described it, that is, as a very important part of Mexico's multilateral presence, perhaps much more so than in the U.S.
Yes, over a long period of time. Now, there are questions back there in the far.
Hi, I'm Rick Reedy. I have a venture firm that is investing in Mexico, so I split my time between here and there. But I love hearing what you're saying about the potential for broadening the G20 and getting some other things done. It sounds like a useful back door, but I just have a real simple question for any of you guys. How long before the G20 becomes the G30, or the demands from other countries make it the G30, the G40, and the G189, or whatever it is up in New York?
Well, it's a good question, and one which I think, from the intellectual academic point of view, we've been talking about for quite some time. The G20, in effect, is not a G20 already. It is a G30. I think it's about a G35 altogether, because you have Spain as a permanent guest. It's not a member, but it's a permanent guest. Each presidency has the privilege of inviting a group of friends from the region. So Mexico has invited Chile and Colombia as regional guests. Plus, there was a decision to invite all of the international financial institution heads. So you have the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF. You have the Secretary General of the OAS. You have the Secretary General of the UN. You have the Inter-American Development Bank. You have the African Union. And you have the ASEAN head, the country that is leading ASEAN, which in this case is Cambodia, and in the case of Africa, it's Benin.
And you have the IMFC and the Development Committee, I just learned on the website.
Yeah, and now ECOWAS out of Africa wants a seat. So in effect, it is no longer a G20. Now, one of the things that we've very seriously discussed in the Think 20, when we discussed the question of how can the G20 work more effectively, is that this process of enlargement is contrary to effectiveness. It's contrary to congeniality among the leaders. It's contrary to a lot of things, especially if you change the countries that are present. This relates to institutionalization. It relates to whether the G20, as currently composed, is the right G20. Are the countries that are at the table, forgetting about all the extra added attractions, but the countries that are members of the G20, the right ones? As you may have heard, there's a big discussion going on about whether Argentina should be at the table, because Argentina is flouting a lot of what we would consider, many of us, to be the rules of the game in terms of global governance, economic governance. We have a country like Chile that probably has much more of a claim to be at the table. The problem is the G20 was set up at a time in which Chile was in a different situation and Argentina was in a different situation. So they decided on Argentina when it was a finance minister, central bank governor forum. In any case, all of these questions relate to the governance question, to the institutionalization, and to the longevity of the G20 beyond where it is today. We'll have to see. There's been no way to reach decisions on this. I mean, the Russians will probably invite, I don't know, Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and who knows who else, and other international bodies will want to sit at the table. Somebody will say that the OAS isn't representative of Latin America, and so therefore maybe somebody else should be sitting. It'll be a very complicated procedure, and each host country so far has to deal with this pretty much on its own.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Andres, as always, gives a very articulate and it covers all the bases answer to the question. Is there has been an effort by all of us in various fora who've been able to be with officials of the host countries to urge them to give leaders only time. In other words, you pull away all the leaders of the international organizations. Spain probably is okay. I mean, once you have a head of state there, there's very little you can do about saying, well, you can't be in the room. So there's, okay, so it's 21. but at least it's not 31 or 35, as Andre said. So, you know, that's one way to do it, at lunches and things like that. The other way, I mean, I dreamed up this scheme where you have two concentric circles, and you have the inner circles leaders only, and on the edges you have the international organizations and whoever else who needs to be, and you leave a couple chairs empty at the leaders table, the inner table of 21, and when you need the head of the IMF to come to the table, or the head of the FSB, or a finance minister who's got an idea or something, you just call, you call him to the table, and he stands there. Otherwise, you have microphones next to these people. If they have one thing to put in, sorry, you've got paragraph 6 wrong, you need to do it this way, so they can actually speak from the back rows. But it gives a difference. The thing I think that if you believe this notion that I'm putting forward of that part of what's happening here is a process and a sort of evolving culture of global leadership that isn't yet defined, in which hopefully stronger leaders than the ones we have now come forward into it and steer it more assertively than has happened so far, then it's important to give the leaders themselves dominion over their own process and to give them opportunities to interact together. It's not for nothing, I think, unless I'm wrong. I think the new Chinese leader who will take office, next year is very fluent in English. That is not a small international fact as far as the development of a culture of discussion. It's very hard to have informal discussions if you have to have simultaneous translation for one of the most important people in the room. So, I think it's just I do think that, that leaders and governments, these 20 governments, can handle a multiplicity of issues because they're handling them anyway. So I am not one who thinks, I don't think it's possible to silo this thing. And that's why I think Mexico's hosting the foreign ministers was a great way to break it open and start a dialogue that's out, that involves the ministers, some of them anyway, and deals with some of the obvious things that are sitting out there, and gradually creep them in. Governments are dealing with these things anyway. There's possibilities to write action plans and programs on water and sanitation and things like this, even though it's not, and it's economic in the end too, by the way. It's infrastructure. It should be related to the G20 action plan on infrastructure. So let's just get smart people in the room and do it. Don't tell us we can't do it because it's not an economic and finance issue. It's just that the world's not going to separate itself that easily. So, yes, I worry about size, and I worry about, being too aggressive, but I also worry about the cost of being too narrow.
So we got time for one last question. And gentleman here, you get a second question unless there's somebody who hasn't. Okay, go ahead.
All right, thanks. Thank you very much. And I actually wanted to offer a comment based not on my current. I'm David Nelson, currently with GE, and I wanted to offer a comment not on my GE experience, which is new, but I spent many, many years at the State Department working on these issues. First of all, to your point about the U.S. agenda versus the Mexican agenda as explained here, I think Mark Sobel was very clear when he started saying he is describing the Treasury Department position. And as a counterpart and colleague of his for many years, I can assure you he has always been a very effective spokesman for the Treasury Department position. I thought that Gerardo did a nice job of explaining the broader Mexican government position. I think that accounts for some of that discrepancy. In terms of the future and the process in the G20, it's important to look at the institutional representation there. As you said, it started as a finance ministry thing in the late 90s in the Asian financial crisis, and only in 2008 turned into a leaders level thing. In the United States, so what they did is they moved it up to the Sherpa level, kind of copying the G8. They said, okay, we'll create a Sherpa in addition to the Treasury negotiators. Different countries brought the Sherpa from different ministries, different bureaucratic organizations. In Mexico, it's the foreign ministry. So you end up naturally getting a broader representation. In the United States, you have Mike Froman from the NSC, who, yes, he's directly at the White House, and that's great. He is a bit more on the Treasury side of the ledger in terms of background and thought than some of the other countries. So you get a little bit of an institutional bias there. Secondly, I think you learn a lot from institutionally from the whole G8 history, which started out as in two areas. One, in terms of the breadth of the agenda, it started out, dealing with the economic crisis. In fact, the oil crisis is what started out discussing, and broadened and broadened and broadened into basically everything, the kitchen sink, some people would argue, and became basically development and climate change and all kinds of interesting, important issues, but arguably became less focused. It also created a whole setup of institutions internal to the G8 in terms of working groups and mechanisms that in some ways were positive because they helped carry through, but in other ways created a bureaucracy that people frankly got sick and tired of. So there may be some resistance to the G20 moving in that direction for that reason of the expansion of bureaucracy. And this actually is why I raised the accountability question earlier, because that, I think, was the other big flaw, I would argue, in the G8, is they really lost the accountability, especially as they got into the development issues and some of those. It became a pledging session. People would throw out pledges that in many cases they had no intention of fulfilling. And there's a concern about, and they were never able to implement an accountability regime. It's vital for the G20 to implement a accountability regime. And I'm a little concerned, and maybe you can give me your response on this. I'm a little concerned at Gerardo's suggestion that the specifics of the accountability regime will not be developed until after the summit, which means it'll be up to the Russian summit to clarify and confirm that. Frankly, I'm not fully confident that a Russian summit is going to really focus on accountability, but maybe you can offer some optimism on that. Thank you.
You want to respond quickly?
Sure. No, excellent comments. And I mean, there's some countries that have Sherpas who are from finance ministries too, like Korea, for example. I think we have to be prepared, actually, to be surprised by the Russians. I mean, let's not write them off before they start. Maybe they're going to do better than we all think. But I think the issues you raise make me put forward an idea that I expressed earlier, which you could provide an interesting verification of or refutation of, which is that there is a difference between G20 summitry and G8 summitry that goes beyond the obvious issue of size. And that is the issues that Andres was mentioning of involvement of civil society, business community, labor, and think tanks. I think it's the case that there was not in the case of the G8 history in the 20th century especially, and even in the 21st century, there has not been a group of think tanks that have accompanied the development of the G8 summit the way there has been with the G20. And the consequence of that is that the think tanks have performed a bridge function in two directions. One is we've been lucky to have been able to participate with host government staffs, prime ministers' staffs, presidential staffs, who, like Lourdes Aranda, the Sherpa, and Gerardo Rodriguez, the G20 deputy in Mexico, to provide ideas where they've set the agenda, and we've responded by offering ideas for them to use. So there's a bridge from the intellectual community, knowledge community in various countries, not just North America or Europe, but various countries into the G20. But as importantly is that think tanks always have conferences and seminars like this one's, right, which are public conferences which involve a much larger public. So the fact that there's been a consistent set of think tanks that have gone along the way with both before and then after November 2008 as the G20 has developed, I think has provided a bridge to society and involves society in a way that the G8 never has been in a consistent way. So it's not just the think tanks, it's also the specific initiatives like the Business Summit and so on, B20 Summit and so on. So the dynamic between the G20 summitry is fundamentally different, I would argue, than G8. The point you make about, counter antibodies developing in bureaucracies against nodes of, pocket working groups, but at least those were informal. And I notice you also use the past tense, which means maybe they're disappearing within the U.S. government, at least as the G8, gets a little bit overshadowed by the G20. But in any case, you could argue that informal working groups is one thing. We've had long debates for a long number of years about a secretariat for the G20, and generally people feel no for the time being.
The witching hour has arrived, and you've all been a very good audience with very good questions. I want to thank the two speakers who have left. I particularly want to thank both Colin and Andres, because I thought that was a very stimulating set of questions and views, and that people should take with them. I want to thank Kent Hughes, who arrived. Kent, do you want to say anything? And
just from the bit of this that I heard, I realized how much I've missed by not being here. I had a long-standing obligation to help shape young minds on the question of globalization. And I'm not sure if I succeeded in that or not, but I'd like to thank the two speakers. It's always a pleasure to see Colin. And thank John Sewell, who's one of the riches here at the Wilson Center.
Thank you. Good. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, John.
Very good.
Right on time.
Greetings. Good to see you. As always, best of luck.